It's midnight, and there you are, staring at your half-baked design, feeling the pressures of the upcoming mid-crits. You know, the design competition is just around the corner, and soon you'll have to present your final project, and you're in knee-deep in self-doubt, wondering if your design will actually stand out amongst the crowd.
And if you're an architecture student, you've probably been here before, wrestling with creativity blocks, questioning every choice, and asking yourself if your design can really shine in this intense competition. And if that sounds like your struggle, you're in great company. In this episode, we're not just going to give you tips. We're sharing real and relatable journey where we unpack the story behind the struggles we went through and our guests went through, and promise to equip you with actionable insights to turn your design challenges into successes.
We're going to talk about the challenges we faced during competitions and how we got through them, our design approaches and how those gave us an edge, and tips and tricks that laid the foundation to our successes in competitions.
So let's get down to business and defeat the Huns. All right, let's go. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Crit Room Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan, with my co-host,
Albert, just Albert.
And joining us today is someone from our own school and is 2 years our underclassman. He won the Bowman competition in his year, placing first amongst over 100 students, and received a great scholarship and entry proposal, and gained valuable connections with some very good architecture firms, ones that have offices in Santa Fe, New York, and Boston. And, I personally would love to join this firm because they are everything I aspired as an architect to be. But without further ado, Andrew Luttrell.
Let's go! How's it going, Andrew?
I'm on a podcast.
Because you guys are in your spring break now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're big.
Yeah, extra dedicated.
This is when I get to lay back and do studio at my pace.
Yeah. I didn't really think I would miss. That's a lie. I would miss the breaks quite a bit, but I wouldn't think I missed them as much as I really did once I started to work full time and everything. Because I'm like, oh yeah, spring breaks, you kind of get used to it. It's just a break from studio, a little breath of fresh air. But once you're working full time, you really start to feel it. You're like, man, when's this next holiday? I need this 3-day weekend bad.
No, because you definitely don't get breaks unless it's like a holiday, and you gotta take it in. I guess that's also why
your precious PTO.
Yeah, I think that's why you start saving those things up so that you can have a spring break or a fall break or anything that you want to have a break for. How's life? Have you watched any movies recently?
Haven't been watching movies recently, but I did just watch through in my evenings. I watched through this series called Pluto.
Pluto?
And it's
I feel like I've heard that before.
It's a Netflix series. It's about Astro Boy. It's taken from the same comics, but it's a different storyline completely.
Interesting.
But it was anime-esque in the art, but then the storyline was just really solid.
Interesting.
There's been a lot of adaptations recently. That's so interesting.
So were you a fan of Astro Boy beforehand, or is that you just got interested by the thumbnail and you were like, I want to click on that?
But I mean, I was a kid once too. I never read any of the comics
back in the ye old times. But yeah, okay. Well, otherwise, first of all, I just want to say it's cool to have other people from K-State on the podcast that aren't a part of the Crit Room crew, because that's kind of what we're wanting to do more in future episodes, at least. We wanted to start to get more of a student's perspective about studio and everything else, because we can only talk from memory for so long before we were just like, oh, forget these old dinosaurs. We need to hear from the source. Yeah. So we're glad to have you on for that thing too.
Yeah, because our information is outdated now, and so we need to plug into the system and get updated most of the times, and that's where you guys come in.
Yeah. But anyways, on the topic of competitions, and especially coming back from spring break, there's a lot of build up to the next project, which would usually lead into competition. So I guess let's talk about your winning project. So would you be able to give us a quick rundown on what that project was for your Bowman competition, and like where's it located, the project goals, program, and all that good stuff?
Mhm. Our project for the Bowman was a little bit different from most. Most Bowman projects are more of a broad scale, like trying to examine the Flint Hills in general. And we really narrowed in on this one little urban site that's catty corner to the capital of
Mm,
Kansas in Topeka. And
Mhm.
so we had the challenge of creating a building for ECOWAS, which is the Economic Council of West African States. And
Mhm.
so this building served multiple purposes. Part of the building was to be a political center, allowing ECOWAS to plug into Topeka. Part of it was a cultural aspect, trying to bring the cultures of West Africa into Topeka and seeing how the two of those would mesh. And then it was just like exploring the relationship between ECOWAS and West Africa and Topeka. And ECOWAS, in the scale of the world, is an agricultural giant.
mm.
They like produce a ton of grain and a ton of different agricultural products. And so the idea for this project was for us to make a space to put that on display in Kansas, representing part of giants of the world coming and befriending Kansas, which is also like Kansas produces, I think, like 15% of the US's grain.
I was just gonna
Mm.
say this sounds like the perfect project for Kansas State. It's like
Yeah,
agriculture. Let's do that.
grain town.
Great town.
Yeah, but it was cultural, it was political, and it was all those things at once.
Mhm.
Wow. I
So yeah,
mean, that's a pretty interesting basis for a competition project, nonetheless. I mean, I'm trying to think back to what we had for our Bowman competition. I believe
We
it was
was in
some
the
type
Alma,
of, I
Alma,
call it the
Kansas.
YMCA, but it was a Boys and Girls Club, basically, yeah, like a student center thing, which on the surface doesn't necessarily feel like it'd be that crazy of a project to really have a lot of investment
we just
because how many YMCA's do you see around here? How many Boys and Girls Clubs do you see? But then how many times have you heard of ECOWAS and then see all that kind of stuff?
Mhm.
It seemed like a pretty interesting startup. Were you excited about it when you first heard the brief?
when I first was introduced to the project, reading through the brief, a lot of it was just daunting because
Mm-hmm.
the time scale of the project, we'd never done a project that long. And then also just the implications of trying to represent West Africa is
Mm.
just so
Yeah.
like West Africa is not one culture. It's
Mhm.
literally hundreds of cultures smashed all together. So like how do they represent themselves? And then how can
Right.
I start to capture that at all?
No, that's huge. I think that's something that's really easy to miss, which I'm glad you picked up on because, yeah, like how do you represent hundreds of different ways of people representing themselves and then translate that into a way that Americans would
Mhm.
understand it from a glimpse of without having any proper context with any prior experience with those kind of cultures, and now you're trying to implement that in literally the middle of the United States. So
Yeah.
it's, yeah, that's pretty daunting. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
with the US there's a lot of like different cultures that are coming in from like immigrants and stuff like that. It's very hard to pinpoint because majority of like the diversity you see in America are towards the coast. And so you're trying to bring in this new set of like perspectives in Kansas specifically. And now I feel like that's so hard to just like try to approach in a way for your project.
I think if anything, that just forced me to approach it humbly.
Yeah.
That's
Hmm.
like the
Hmm.
big thing that I got from it was that I know nothing.
Yeah.
Well,
Like
speaking about that, what did you do in your early research and your concept development phases that like made you approach it in that same way?
yeah, my initial research was trying to just grasp what West Africa is, what it's like to live there, what the people there do and think, and how they recreate. So, one specific avenue for that I really honed in on was dance. And
Mm.
dance takes multiple forms across West Africa. It has varied forms within every culture. But what I noticed was that as I began to engage more with specific cultures trying to understand how they use dance. It was used for storytelling, it was used religiously, it was used just because dancing's fun.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that became my initial study, was the study of dance as sort of a cultural expression.
And just to make sure I'm understanding this, um, when you're doing the research, was that something you picked up on and immediately knew, oh, that's how I can implement this into the ECOWAS project? Because you think of dance in, agriculture, there's not a pretty clear bridge that ties those things together. So were you just that was the first thing that you noticed and you're just writing it down for later, or did you immediately know, hey, that's something I should use in this project?
And I think that part of me had some initial hunches about how to apply it architecturally, but I think mostly it was just a process of engaging with the cultures and trying
Okay.
to build an understanding of how they function, how dance is used for them. Later, it did become an architectural expression, and we can talk more about that later. But
Oh,
initially, it
for
was
sure.
just a research process. I reading books. I created a whole YouTube playlist just called West African Dance. It has like a
Dude,
hundred
that's
some videos
cool.
in it. Just trying to get as much content as I could about that.
I think that's really nice to hear then, because I think one of the parts in our earlier years, especially with Professor Hits Different, is she was really trying to get us to deeply understand, as much as we possibly can, just sitting in a studio, deeply understand the types of people, like the demographics, just who are we, what culture are we jumping into, and what are we like, let's learn the land a little bit, let's figure out who is
Yeah.
here, let's learn about them, let's learn about what their wants are, what their
Let's show
desires are, what
respect.
their pain points are. Yeah, and then using all that, you now start to
Right?
build this quasi relationship with almost understanding what these people are about, and
Hmm.
you can, as Albert was saying, serve them respectfully instead
Hmm.
of arrogantly going into a project, just searching up the basic demographic charts and being like, oh, now I all of a sudden know this completely. Because, just looking at charts, you can't really understand anything about any
Hmm.
cultures or whatever. I think it's, as you were pointing out, really going into the cultures and the arts and just figuring out what they value from that stance. I think that shows you a lot more about what these people are about.
Yeah. And I specifically remember you coming into our studio and you said something that like kind of blew my mind, which was that you were listening to a lot of music and you caught onto this idea of what was it, the beats or something. Like they
Polyrhythm.
had, yeah, polyrhythm, and I had no idea what that was. I don't know if you can elaborate on that type of thing.
Yeah, yeah. My study of dance became a study of polyrhythm just as a tool. Polyrhythm is basically when you have like four beats in a measure on one hand and then three beats in a measure on the other. So like,
Mm.
I can't do that.
and like, but no, but I had to practice that for weeks and weeks,
Mm,
like listening to a YouTube video with like the ding,
Mm.
ding, ding, and like trying to understand how it feels.
mm-hmm,
Um, yeah, the polyrhythm was a big takeaway from dance because throughout the different cultures, like you've got some dances where the whole body stays still and the feet move, other dances where the feet stay still and the whole body moves. But then throughout almost all of them, polyrhythm was consistent. And so,
mm-hmm,
especially the 2 on 3 and the 3 on 4 polyrhythms were used all over. And so that was like really a binding together of like, okay, our dances are so culturally specific and they help us identify ourselves from each other. But what
Mm.
binds us together is the polyrhythms that we all use.
mm-hmm.
That's pretty neat. So yeah, that's going back to trying to figure out a way to represent so many different cultures with one type of expression.
As a
So while we're still on this early research and everything else, I want to also cover, because our audience is probably wondering for themselves, how
and
do they set themselves up for success? And I think research is the most important part of the entire process, because that sets you up for whatever the project's going to be. It sets the foundations. I was curious about, when you were doing all this research,
and
what did you notice between you and your other peers of how your research styles were varying? And do you believe that your specific method
the
set
whole
you apart from your other peers right then and there?
throughout, I think if you had asked me that question a year ago, I would not have had an answer for you. But but the more I've gone into research heavy process, the more I've begun to understand the truth of a quote by a professor who shall not be named because we don't have a good name for him. Um, the truth by one of my current professors, and he said that you know you're right on it when you're enjoying it.
Mm,
And
Mm.
so, at least for me, what helped me keep pursuing my research and what helped me make it a part of my process throughout and keep developing it as I went on was finding something that I personally enjoyed. And that may be prideful and self centered, but it allowed me to personally connect with the peoples that I was researching.
mhm.
Yeah. No, that's
That's just
huge.
amazing.
Another thing that really helped me was coming into your studios, coming and talking to fifth years and fourth years, and finding people who've been doing this longer than I am, and finding
Mm,
people who have different perspectives than I do, who have different life experiences than I do, just as sounding boards and trying to like have a more rich understanding of architecture by talking with you guys. So
right.
I also want to give credit where credit's due to you guys for being
Oh,
sounding boards for me, helping me develop my ideas by talking with you about
I
them.
remember you coming to our studio a lot, and you with your sketchbook, and then you'd be just asking us questions because like you said, we've been here before, and so you would ask us some advice and stuff like that, and it kind of blew me away because not a lot of students did that, and I was like, you know what, this man's he knows what he wants and he knows what to do, and yeah, no props, no, just as much as it was like us, I think that the first steps was always taken by you, and you got to give props to yourself for
Yeah.
Well, knock initially answer to you, seek and you shall find.
that.
Like, you're not gonna find people who are willing to help you if you don't look for
Mm,
Hmm.
yeah.
I think you going through all these extra steps, I personally think that is really what set your projects apart from the very beginning of the project phase,
Hmm.
being able to go and talk to other people, being able to find and deeply embed yourself into all this research versus what probably majority or the average student would do is just do a simple couple articles, look those up, read through them, and just jot down a couple notes and just move forward.
Right.
But I think you really deeply studying this, talking to a bunch of older years and figuring out their perspectives on your approach and everything else, I think that just gave you a lot of confidence to know that what you were doing is the right way to go
Mm,
about it. And I
it.
mean, clearly that set you apart.
yeah. I mean, Ryan too. You were also a finalist for most of the competitions. What was your process like, and what made you stand out?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a two-parter thing. I will say two-parter because half of the information, if I were to go above and beyond and do extra research steps like Andrew did, I probably would have come across this information a lot sooner. I was given a lot of information about the history of the building next to us that you can't really find through just basic, you know, Google searches. A lot of it just comes down to if you're a local, you know things better than people who are on the internet. So
Right.
they were able to give me additional information at the end so that I
Wait,
tried to.
before you go further, what was the project? What was the project?
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, so we were in Kansas City. We were doing a project, an annex project to the Boone Theater. It's a historical theater for jazz music and a lot of other performing arts. And our project was basically creating a mixed use building that was meant to add an additional program of a black box theater to the already existing theater and then add apartments, retail, offices. So it's a
Mm,
big
mixed
program to
use.
handle, which was its own challenge in its own rights. But it's also trying to think beyond the brief and see it from a surface level. Okay, we're building a jazz club. So then we're like, okay, well, let's go a little bit further. Like, let's try and find the extra little spicy sauce to this thing and figure out
Hmm.
how to make this more appealing to the general public too. And, not leave it just become a jazz club. I stumbled upon the concept of, how can we enjoy jazz music in a whole different way? The black box acting as a vessel to do that because a black box, the way it's set up, it's a whole different configuration of theater. The original traditional theater is you just have a stage in the front and a bunch of seating in the back, but the black box, you have the stage in the center and there's seats all the way around the perimeter.
Mm,
So that also comes with a lot of different performance types. It's a lot more intimate because there's people around you on all sides. But the big implication of that was studying the area and trying to do the research from that part. We actually went to the site for one of our studio days. We got to walk the grounds and just see what is a literal everyday in the life experience walking around this neighborhood.
Hmm.
Who are the people that we ran into? And we actually got to talk to some of the locals in that neighborhood and just ask them bits and pieces of what they thought about this project that we were theoretically doing and get their input on that stuff. And I really think that helped push people to design it differently than if they were to just do articles or
Hmm.
research whatever the history is on the Boone Theater and stuff. You just wouldn't be able to get this kind of information.
Hmm.
But the crucial part was when you're actually walking the site, you got to witness how people were moving around this neighborhood or this district. And that was when I got that spark of an idea where I'm like, oh, I'm noticing a lot of people are actually using these alleyways to cut across these, corners of the blocks and everything. I wonder if there's a way to use that for the project for something. Not really thinking it would be something huge at the time. Probably similar to how you didn't think like dance would be that crucial of a design move in your project until it snapped in your head and you're like, oh wait, that here we go. Okay. Now we're cooking. But using that, since they were using the alleyways, we found next to our project site there was this empty plaza area behind one of the neighboring buildings. And to me, I'm like, well, if people are using these alleyways all the time, anyways, just to connect to different parts, what if we make that intersection become a thing for the people so
Hmm.
they can utilize that as like a plaza space or just a communal area, something like that. And then after iteration, I finally stumbled upon this idea of like experience jazz in a whole new way. Well, I'm sure it's not super brand new to experience it from outside. You have outdoor performances all the time. But if you can use the black box theater as the basis, you could have some type of opening to that jazz club or that black box theater, and then use that to feed into this plaza space. And now all
Hmm.
of a sudden you have like three dynamic performances all at the same time. That I think is what set me apart from most of the other students in the group because
It was
they were
very
focusing
building.
very inward
Yeah,
on the
very
site. They weren't
building,
thinking about possibilities beyond the
connecting
scope.
outside,
Right.
connecting outside the building. And yeah,
Yeah.
dude,
And I
that
don't think I
project.
would have figured that out unless we were there doing quote unquote extra steps in the research.
Yeah, site visits.
Yeah.
No, I think that your site visit and even like your typology research, like it's not the same. Like with Andrew, his was like the cultural research and
Hmm.
how these different people, like different types of people, came together and how you can try to represent these people. With yours was like this idea of researching building typology and also like I guess like the theater typology where the black box theater versus like the standard traditional one. And I think those types of research, even though it's not really about like the users or the occupants of the space, it is about the building itself. And I think it's really important to also research buildings just as it's important to research who it's made for.
Something else I wanted to ask about is relating to the design process and the journey of creating this project. Do you know if there were any specific instances while you're going through this design process that stood out as pivotal moments for you? Like, beyond the research. Like, do you think there was like a notable breakthrough in your approach or like your perspective, and wanted to hear your thoughts on that?
A few moments that really punctuated my process for that project. The first was realizing that the notion of dance could inform my structural system.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
So that,
How did that happen?
yeah, so the idea of columns as legs was like really, really convincing to me. The study I had done of dance and the movements and the polyrhythm that began to inform my structural column grid. And so that allowed it to break the grid in a reasoned way that followed a logic, but still allowed it to be fun and somewhat unpredictable.
Yeah.
Mm.
That was one key moment. And that column structure of dancing column legs sort of stuck with me throughout the rest of the project. But another moment for me that really stood out was about probably a week and a half before our final presentation. We were supposed to be like getting all of our final stuff ready, and I had hit massive creative block and
Oh
just
We were
like
just
no.
could
about to
not
talk about
produce.
this actually.
Well, I'm already there.
Yeah, no, this is great. Keep going.
No, I hit this massive creative block. Like, just could not get the energy to produce my final drawings, and I said, okay, I need something else. And so, for me, usually it would be like going and talking with you guys, or sketching, or taking a brain break, walking through the hallways, just looking at drawings.
Mm,
But that specific afternoon, I reached for some clay that belonged to one of my desk mates, and I've worked with clay since high school. I did some pottery classes, and so it's a familiar medium to me. And I took that clay and I just started thinking about the first floor of the building. And I hadn't really resolved how this structure of dancing legs and the skin around it, how that would meet the site. And
mm,
so this clay model was a way for me to just study it physically with my hands. And
Hmm.
so I started molding this clay, getting in there with my thumbs, feeling it, and that allowed me to create this sort of 3D representation of what I thought would be a pretty fun park.
mm.
And I was like, well,
Interesting.
there's not a park in the program. I
Oh.
want there to be. And so I talked with my professor, and he helped me work through sort of a phasing for this park to be a part of the project. And so the idea was that there'd be a park there for 2 years before the building was constructed.
Oh
Hmm.
wow.
And so that actually set up this relationship with it being catty cornered to the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's this huge Capitol lawn around it. And like technically it's public green space, but you don't go throw a football on the Capitol lawn. Like,
Right,
Yeah.
right.
you don't take your kids out for a picnic and fly a kite on the Capitol lawn.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so that sort of established this relationship of, okay, maybe this little rectangle, maybe that's the actual public green space.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that park being there for 2 years, people of Topeka could come and see the space and get to know it and get to love
Yeah.
it. And then when the building was built, the first floor was an abstracted version of that park turned into a conversational program.
Mm,
And so then the people of Topeka could walk in and say, oh, I know this building, this is my park. Which then
Mm.
gives
mm-hmm.
them a personal connection to that building, which then allows them to be drawn up into the rest of the building to engage with the cultures of West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. Like, I admire your creative thinking so strongly. It's from going from studying dance styles to polyrhythms and being able to turn those abstract ideas into physical architecture is something that I think is a trait in the most talented architectural designers that we study. And I think it also is just such an integral part of what it means
Mm-hmm.
to be an architectural designer. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the human aspect of architecture. You're finding these arts and you're translating in ways that are very difficult for many people to do. And I think, just like many other things, that's a
Mm-hmm.
skill that you can probably practice. And this is a little bit of a tangent question, but I do want to talk about it since it's so important. How do you come up with these translations from the abstract into
And
the more physical or tangible
Practical.
aspects?
Yeah.
Yeah, practical aspects of architecture. Because our professor hits different. She also had us go through a very similar process of coming up with these things. We would research, come up with art, and translate that art into our buildings, in our
Mm-hmm.
concepts. So I'm
Yeah.
curious if you had a similar style or a similar process. What do you think helped you tie these gaps or tie these bridges between the abstract and the tangible?
that's an excellent question. I took a whole seminar on that last semester.
Really?
Um, Professor Newspaper's got a seminar called Theories of Translation, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's an excellent seminar. But no, that's a question I'm asking myself all the time today. I mean, even with my current studio work, I'm still having to investigate translations of
Mm-hmm.
concept and research and art to an architectural expression.
Mm-hmm.
One one practice that Professor Newspaper had us engage with was collage. That's one of his personal favorites.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that did help me just understanding this information. So I had Professor Mushroom the previous semester,
Yeah.
and And one of his focuses, he was a self-proclaimed maximalist. One of his
Yep.
things was like just getting more information and just like having this massive web of almost data, research,
Yeah.
architectural precedents, things that you can pull from people within your own process. And then that semester with the Bowman project, I began to understand that this information, this huge cluster of information, can be formulated into layers that you can then understand as separate from each other. And then you can
Mm-hmm.
start to understand those engagements. And so, even just that process of understanding layers of information really helped me, especially with the straightforwardness of, okay, we're superimposing ECOWAS onto Topeka. These are two different layers of information and
Mm-hmm.
investigating how those interact.
I want to say before we move into our next step about talking about the narrative formation and everything else, I do want to wrap up this earlier on research and schematic phase by asking one more question. So I think when many students are starting, there might be this preconception that whatever idea you come up with first is just what you run with for the entire project. And even though that's not always true, in fact, I'm sure many students go through multiple iterations. That is part of the question. I wanted to ask, what do you think you found your quote unquote winning idea? Do you think you found it right away, or did you find yourself restarting several times? Or was it after the mid crit and then you finally got this really insightful piece of advice and that made you basically restart?
I think at first I was really attached to what I thought the project was supposed to be. And then I had a mid crit that was rough, that was like, I like the ideas here, but it's not coming through.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually was really helpful for me because I was realizing that I was too focused on just one form of expression. I was
Mm,
absorbed with the columns up until mid crits.
Mm-hmm.
And so that encouraged me, like, even I was talking about this with my sister in the car, separating myself from my project, being able to step back and critique it myself. It was a fair critique. It needed more development outside of just the columns. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was sort of a process of engaging the problem from different perspectives, different pieces of art, different types of dance, how they influence just different processes, just trying to get a more holistic view of what this thing should be. And
Mm-hmm.
so while I never had any explicit like here's a stop, restart, I had
mm,
a number of moments where I would say, okay, it's developing and I think it needs to go this way, but I really like this thing. But if I have to do away with this thing for the project to grow, okay. And so there are a number of ideas that I had that I really liked and that I was attached to,
yeah.
but were not right for the project.
Mm-hmm.
I can relate to that a lot. I was talking to Albert about this for the competition project itself too. There was a moment when I was really starting to develop this black box aspect of the project. I was still trying to come up with different methods of, towards the final phase of cladding it. And now that I know this plaza exists, now this black box on the outside really becomes a feature moment. It's no longer just this back of house element. It's now a prominent feature that needs to be celebrated. And I was running through some options with Albert and was telling him, this is the concept and this is the idea. And I want to do this thing that I found a precedent for so badly, but it's not working. And I feel it in it viscerally, it doesn't feel like the right move, but I'm really struggling to want to do away with it because,
Mm-hmm.
like you were saying, part of me knew like if this is going to hold me back and letting the project excel, something has to be trimmed here. It has to be translated a different way. And then Albert helped me to figure out, even though this is a great idea, it doesn't match what's going on with the rest of your project. And I think you need to explore some other ideas that have the same language as your project. So it went from one material to a whole, or matching it back with what the context was. Instead of
Mm-hmm.
doing this metal cladding idea to help it, stand out and contrast as an element, it was like, what if it was better to just wrap it as a part of the project and make it stand out in a different way? So
Mm-hmm.
it was being able to let go of certain ideas, regardless of how good you feel about it, and just get some outside feedback. In my case, to have people say, "No, this isn't it."
No, because there's a lot of ideas that you can cook up with, but then like you've been in the kitchen before. There's a lot of different spices, but like there's specific spices that work well together and that makes the food taste so good. And projects are very similar in that same regard, where like you can't just mash in a bunch of different ingredients and expect it to like taste good or like look good. Even you have to put in the right ingredients so that you can make something that
And
tastes good and looks good.
so
Hmm. No, that's a
I
good metaphor.
I like cinnamon just as much as you, but we're making tacos.
Yeah.
And then the last part, I just want to ask it a slightly different way. When did you know that you were on your final iteration of the project?
I think really that move of introducing the park was for me sort of not a finishing point, but it clarified
Hmm.
what I had left fuzzy intentionally because I didn't know what to do with it. And so for me, that was the building could be understood as cohesive and met the site in a way that I understood. So for me, that like didn't close the book in any way. I kept progressing after that, but that
Mm.
was the final move that helped me feel sure about it.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
no, that's really
No,
helpful.
we were always taught by like Professor Hit's different, that like in every competition that there's always this one rule that you need to break so that your project thrives and becomes successful. Like for example, with Stephen Hall in the Nelson Atkins Museum, there was a competition that was held for all design firms out there, and the design was for the museum in Kansas City, and there were a lot of entries from a lot of different firms from everywhere. And but when he went and visited the site itself, he noticed that like the projects were better suited to be in another site, and so he said, "F this site that you gave me. I'm not gonna follow this." So he didn't follow the brief and proceeded the project and decided to use another location for the building and actually won. And I
Hmm.
think in your case, Andrew, and even Ryan, you guys thought outside the box and then started creating this space that could interact with the environment outside of the building. And so I wanted to ask you guys a little bit about that. Did you guys think about breaking that specific rule? Because it's different to be decisive about which rule to break. It's also different to be like, this is a really cool project, and then you didn't even decide. It just happened to be a rule break that you were like, oh, I'm okay with this rule break. So like how did you guys even think about like deciding to break that rule, or was it just something that your like intuition happened?
Do you
Ryan,
want
you
to take
want to
it
go
first?
first?
Okay, I mean, I can.
I'll let you
I
go
just want to be
first.
guest honor, but okay. The reason I have a quick answer because I was thinking about this retroactively. I think a better way to phrase it, maybe at least from my perspective, is I was never intentionally thinking about it as breaking the rules. It was always coming down to what does the project need in order to be successful.
Hmm.
I was gonna say that.
Did I take yours? Okay. Like, what does the project need to be successful? And for my particular one, I was inspired by this. Has a little bit of a backstory to it because I did not used to have this mentality. It came back to like my year's Bowman competition where we noticed another student for the Boys and Girls Club. We were our specific studio was told to stick within our site, and in
Hmm.
fact, we had to take away buildable area from our site to create this plaza space. So we were just thinking in our studio from a perspective of, oh, these site boundaries need to be respected at all times. In fact, you need to have external space even put onto your site. So that's how strict we were thinking. And then when we went to the competition, we saw the winner had literally built a part of her proposed project on the rooftop of a different building. And for me, I was triggered a lot because I'm like, wait a minute. This one because she broke the rules, but we had to double down on the rules and even add another rule onto our project just to have it become a project. So I was heated in that moment. But then after maturing and realizing, okay, there are things to learn here. What can we do? It was making me realize it wasn't just that she broke the rules. She had a reason for building on the rooftop of the building next door. It was to expand parts of the program that were in her building using an extension of that space onto the adjacent buildings. So I mean, you can argue back and forth about whether that was a good idea or not. But what that made me realize is you don't always have to think so binary with your project. If you think that for the purpose of this project, it suits to be better in a different spot, like the Nelson Atkins, the original proposal was to put the extension in front of the building. But Stephen Hall's like, that's ridiculous. If you had the new building in front of the old one, all you would be staring at is the new one, and you couldn't see the old with the new. So then he proposed himself to say, you know what, forget that rule. We're putting it on the side so we can pay homage to and respect the original building while still having the new one be a prominent feature and exist on the side of the building or whatever.
Mm.
So, with my project at least, using that plaza space as an extension of an already thought out idea, to me, it was like it wasn't breaking a rule. There was never any rule that said don't expand beyond it. It was just there's an opportunity here. I'm just going to go with it and propose it, and maybe people will like it enough to say, yeah, actually, let's do that.
Echoing Ryan's sentiment very much. Nobody ever said like you're limited to not doing anything before construction starts. Like it was a broken down coffee shop or something that hadn't been in service for a number of years on that site. And so to me, the idea of putting the park there was just after the development of the project as it had gone, it seemed intuitive. And it
Mm.
was never, I was never looking at it and thinking, how can I outsmart the other people? Or like, how can I be special? It was always just, this is a reasonable approach to introducing the site. It was, as Ryan said, what does the project need? And really, in that moment, it was specifically what do the people of Topeka need? Because
Mm.
I'd spent a lot
Mm,
of time focusing the building on the people of West Africa, but I sort of neglected the fact that that building is an interface with Topeka. And so it was really just how do I serve both parties actually and not just with lip
mm-hmm.
service.
Yeah. And I also think the issue is a bit more nuanced than just saying, oh, it'd be really great if I could just demolish the building next door so I can build this park that I want to. Not saying that was your project. I'm just thinking of another example. Like, because it's different to say, oh, my project needs a park, therefore I want to take down the building next door to add that park.
Mm.
It's another one to say, like Andrew is saying, like, well, let's use the site that we have and make that a park first, and then we can build. There's a cat. You gotta watch
There's
the YouTube
cat.
video.
Cat.
Everyone immediately flocks over to the YouTube. But again, I think it's very nuanced. It's a different story to say, oh, I want to completely get rid of this thing just to make my project idea stand out versus having innate concepts that benefits from having additional items to it.
Mhm.
And it all comes down to what is your reasoning, what's your rationale. And if it's not strong enough, if it doesn't connect with your audience well enough, it's not going to stand no matter how revolutionary of an idea it is.
Mhm.
But let's pretend with the Stephen Hall example again, right? It could have easily been the case where the client was like, no, we want it to be in front. And he could have just not won. It was literally 50-50 chance for him to win the project or not by breaking the rules. In fact, you could argue that it made even less sense for him to win because he didn't follow the brief.
Yeah.
But because his rationale was so strong, because his concept worked so well, because his proposal was so good, they later were like, you know what? That is the right idea.
I'll let it
We are
slide.
convinced. Yeah, it's not like the wrong message here is don't break the rules and win. It's no, that's not going to work in your favor if that's what you're doing. But okay, so we got through a pretty laborious process of explaining the research and beginning phases. And I think it was beneficial because that's where a lot of these ideas start to come from, and that's how your building comes about. However, that's only half of what it means to actually do the competition and everything. You have to also develop your narratives. You have to also do the presentation and everything else. So we wanted to start going into the conversation about how did you begin to construct your narrative, right? How, now that you've been developing this project through the whole design process, at a certain point you have to also figure out what is this narrative? How are you going to be talking about your projects and these
Right.
certain bullet points that you're going to talk about, certain hit points that will get people interested in what you're talking about,
Right.
and a lot of things that go into it.
Yeah,
So
because you're given like how many, like you're given like 7 minutes to present or something, 5 to 7 minutes to present, and you only have 15 minutes to like talk to the juror or something like that.
yeah, so there's a lot of filtering in place. How do
Yeah.
you possibly condense all these ideas. Was there anything that you specifically remember doing that helped you channel what your narrative was going to be about?
Yeah, for me, I remember like writing down bullet points for my narrative and thinking back about the quote about Frank Lloyd Wright about how he would always like lie about his narrative. He'd always make something up, because like tell a good story and they'll believe it kind of thing. And I
Mhm.
felt like I was doing that, even though I really wasn't. But I just, the way I talk about my project now and the way I presented my project was not actually like, it wasn't chronological to how my process went. And I think for me, that was a big realization of how I tell the story of the unfolding of a concept to a building doesn't have to be explicitly, I did this and then I did this and then I did this.
Hmm.
Because in reality, I had done the dance studies before I had ever realized that they were a cultural symbol and that they were a way to understand ECOWAS in West Africa in relation to Topeka. It was just an instinctual thing. And so for me, big moments were meeting with my professor, talking through my narrative, even got me access to the Rainier Auditorium. So we were able to go in there one night with me and him in my studio. And I think it's the night before, or maybe 2 nights before.
Stress.
No, I
Yeah.
was like dripping sweat, trying to present, and like there's this huge auditorium, bunch
Yeah.
of
Dude.
seats, like 8 people sitting in them.
It's
Dude.
intimidating regardless. Yeah.
No, but it helped me build confidence because coming to the actual presentation, I'd been in that space. I knew that the clicker, you click it, and then about 4 seconds later, the slide changes. I knew how the computer worked. And so all of that initial getting flustered about a new space was gone because I'd been there. And so it's just a little thing in terms of being more confident in my presentation, but that actually
Hmm.
helped me a lot because I was comfortable and I was free to actually talk through my my process and my presentation more
Hmm.
conversationally and not having to worry about, okay, now I click it and then now I say what I'm thinking. Like it just was able
Hmm.
to roll more smoothly.
With the Bowman, each studio puts up a finalist so that they compete with the other finalists for other studios. It's so admirable that your studio mates actually went out to that same day to actually help out with how you present your narrative. And I respect that so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate them for that. And I tell like my girlfriend or my mom this sometimes. I feel like I didn't deserve to win.
Oh, that's the imposter syndrome.
No, it
Related.
is.
Yeah.
And part of it is just like purely having been up there and seen everybody else's projects and been like,
Mm,
wow, I don't stand up to this. But part of it for me was like when our studio voted for who was going to go to represent us. The original thought was that our professor would have one vote, the judges would have one vote, and then the studio would have one vote. And so
mm-hmm,
Mm.
whoever the people voted for would be one vote compared to
Right.
professor and the judges.
mm-hmm.
And what got me was that the professor wanted one person, the judges wanted another, but the people that I largely convinced was my studio. And so the
Wow.
reason that I was chosen to go represent us was because like it was something like a little over half of the votes in the studio were for me. And he
Mm,
was like,
Wow.
normally I wouldn't do this, but you guys seem to have formed a consensus within yourselves. So
mm-hmm,
I want to
Mm.
honor that. And so for me, like
Yeah.
that was when I was like, okay, my studio's behind me.
yeah.
So then it just reminded me that like this whole time, yes, I'm competing with these people, but also they're going through the process with me. Throughout my
Mm-hmm,
process, I've been
Mm.
talking with them. They're the people who on the daily I'm like, hey, this doesn't make sense to me. Does this make sense to you? And they say, yeah, that
mm-hmm.
makes sense. Or they say, actually, you need to change that. So, and like, no, seriously, just like all the time being like, hey, Lindsay, is this good or bad? It could be better. Okay. I think yeah, having that studio environment where we're all talking to each other and like actively receiving critique from each other was
Mm-hmm,
what allowed us to become closer and made them feel comfortable showing up at 6 p.m. to watch me
Mm-hmm.
present this horrible presentation. In
This
reality,
is a tangential question.
less.
It seems like an overwhelming narrative online, especially. People are saying studio culture is very toxic. They're saying that, especially when it comes to competitions, it can't be beneficial for your studio because secretly everyone's trying to outcompete with each other. But wanted to ask you from firsthand experience then, you were just hinting towards the fact that like that wasn't necessarily the case for your guys' studio. It was actually more of everyone was very open armed and trying to encourage people to develop the project better.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that's right, or do you think that there was still like both exist at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's sort of almost the harmony of those two. There was definitely an element of competition, and there's no denying that everybody wanted to win
Mm-hmm.
selfishly.
Mm-hmm.
But there's been a consensus within a lot of the folks that I talked to within my year, because the year above us had really suffered from that competitive spirit. And we
Mm.
saw that. And most people I talked to were like, yeah, it'd be great to win. It'd be really cool to go. But I need to do this to make a good project. And if I go, I go. If I don't, I don't. And so that was really encouraging to me, like
Mm-hmm.
having a balance of I would really like to go and I want to compete with you, but also you're my friend and I
Yeah.
want to see you succeed too. Thinking so I want us
That's
to
really
all
nice. Yeah.
develop good projects.
It's empowering to know that mentality still exists, especially in studios that are below us. Because from again, we've graduated now, so we don't necessarily walk down the hallways like we used to. So we don't get to see all these things happening live. But it's encouraging to know that this idea of camaraderie still is very deeply embedded in the studio culture. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's only getting better. So I'm hoping that starts to reflect itself more in the narrative, especially online. But
Mm-hmm.
again, that was a tangential question, but I thought it was really important to bring up.
So when you're starting out the project, right, it's very different than when you're presenting it. Because when you're starting a project, you're doing from here, process, but then a lot of that stuff gets cut back for the final presentation. And so we were wondering, how do you what is the ratio that you need to put in your final presentation, like, so that it could be successful? And I wanted to relate that into how you present your project. With was it How did you tie
Was
in
it like
your
20% schematic design and concept development,
right,
40% showing the floor plans, 30% storyline, or,
right? And it's
you
even
know,
like, how did you tie in your research to how you present? Like, because they don't need to know everything, right?
right. There's a lot of filtering.
No, that's a really good question. I think for me, starting to compose the presentation, it was sort of all narrative at first. And what I mean by that is that I had some of it that was early process and then some drawings that I produced explicitly for the presentation. And then of
Mm,
course like at the end I talked through my plans, but it was all about talking through, at least for me, it was all about talking through just the whole examination and the whole study of it and trying to think about it cohesively as early process leads me to some architectural elements that develop through diagrams, which leads me to developed floor plans and sections that express the diagrams
hmm
in these ways. And
hmm
so I don't know if there's any exact ratio of process to finished drawings to just talking. I think it's sort of more about having all of those things relate to each other.
Mm.
And it's less about the ratio and more about the mixing.
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
like when you're making a bread, like you were talking about, like how you let it raise and how you knead it will affect it just as much as what you put in it. And so that's my
No, that's a
short
good
answer.
take. Something I was just thinking about while you were talking is I think it's very similar to how you would structure your boards and how you would structure a portfolio potentially. It's not necessarily about trying to cram all of your work into the presentation because you put the time and effort into it, therefore you're showing it. It's more of, well, I'm not really, let's pretend that your building has 6 floor plans, right? There's no reason to include all 6 floor plans in your project unless you're literally talking through why each one is specifically important to your concept or your overall idea. I see this mistake a lot in a lot of first iterations of people's portfolios where they're like, "Oh, I did all the work. I had to show it off." But if you're only talking about your first floor and your third floor and your fifth one, then just show those three and explain why they're the important ones. You don't, no one's going to walk through all of them anyways. So why put in the extra, preserve some of the white space,
Yeah.
allow things to be interpreted, and they can ask questions at the end of it if they're really lost and confused. But I think the important part is the filtering of information. Do you really need this thing? Is it tying back to your concept, like you were just saying? And you were just talking about, how the structure in your case was tied to that diagram, and showing those two next to each other or on the separate slides or something like that. I think there's very important parts about just knowing what do you really need for your project and presenting that
Mm-hmm.
as a clear storyline between beginning to end,
Right.
getting rid of all the extra scenes. It's like a movie too. You don't like, do you think they use every single thing they shoot? No, they probably leave like half of that footage on the cut room floor.
Right. What's the decision making though, and like when you do that type of stuff? Because obviously you have this wide variety of all the drawings that you have. How do you decide what gets cut back?
I think for me, it's sort of like giving an elevator pitch of your project, or like
Mm.
being at
Mm,
Design Expo and somebody's like, talk me through one of your projects. I'm not going to sit there and talk to you for 7 minutes about this project. Um,
yeah.
so it's really about like how can I capture the essential ideas and the big diagrams and how they express themselves architecturally without talking through everything necessarily. And I
Mm-hmm.
think when
Hmm.
you scale that up to like the whole project and the final presentation, it's sort of the same thing where you have this breadth of work that you've produced, so much research, so many drawings, but which of them are necessary to communicate what's going on?
Some piece of advice that we got from Professor Hotdog, actually, that has stuck with me, is he introduced this idea of chunking information. And that's important because, again, Andrea was saying, you're not going to be able to express every single thought that happened in your 6 week, 7 week process
Mm-hmm.
in only 5 minutes. So you have to figure out what's the important parts. And this is just an arbitrary number that I've come up with, but I think the rule of threes is prominent in pretty much every piece of media. It's just bullet point 1, 2, and 3. Can you present your project and point out just three things? Start
Mm-hmm.
with that. What is your concept? What is the biggest part of that concept in your building? And maybe like one of the best renders. Start there. This is particular for portfolios. You can expand upon this a lot more with actual presentations, but that really helps you to narrow down, okay, if these are the three most important things, what else do I need to plug into each bullet point to help make it breathe a bit more?
Mm-hmm.
And the hard part then is figuring out where's that limit to where you cut off the plugins. It's very nuanced. I think it's
Yeah.
just you know it when you know it. And that's why you need outside eyeballs on it to help
Yeah.
you understand this isn't necessary. You're showing 5 floor plans, you're only talking about 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're
And
like, oh, good point. Let me get rid of the other 3.
that's even like more important because sometimes when you get the project brief in the syllabus, they list out what drawings you need. But then
Right.
when you're like when you're trying to present the project, you're like these things that you're wanting from me does not really aid in how I present this project and the narrative and everything. Why do I need to do them?
Mm-hmm.
That was one of my professor that semester, Professor Newspaper. That was one of his personal like pet peeves about architecture school. And so whenever we would ask like, what do you want for our final boards? Or when I was saying, what do you want for this presentation? He said, put the drawings that you need to communicate your project. And so some of us would have two diagrams, some of us would have seven, some of us would
Yeah.
have every floor plan, some of us would have 135. And I think even just like in the studio, he was encouraging us constantly know what you need to represent your process. If you don't need to show your structural diagram because it's not a part of your investigation, if it's just a de facto structural diagram, don't put it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we
Mm-hmm.
don't need to know that you had a column grid. We can read that on the plans.
Right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Big
Yeah,
brain.
I think that also helps with structuring your presentation too. I bring this up because I talked about this in other podcast episodes before too, but I've noticed that there was a substantial difference when I decided to actively put my sections prior to the plans in most of my presentations, and that's received a lot of great feedback from judges in the past. For whatever reason, at least in the way that I was presenting my drawing or presenting my project, showcasing the sections first allowed people to understand the moves that I was doing a lot clearer than just showcasing the floor plans in a traditional fashion of here's floor plan, here's section, here's render. It's a little bit easier for people to visualize the space first when it's in a section or perspective, and then they can get into the more nitty-gritty details as you start to work backwards from a big picture render to a section to a plan.
Yeah, and I think that's
So
even true. Like I always present like diagram first, and like
yeah.
with that idea of presenting the section first, communicate how it feels to be there. And then later, if you
Right.
want to go back and figure out how that actually works architecturally, you can look at the plan, look at the sections, look at it closely. But like,
Hmm.
show me how it feels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think there are some general rule of thumbs or, quote unquote laws of architecture presentations. I think it makes sense to almost always put site context, a little blurb of research, plus diagrams are like the first three of every project.
Plans
It's
and
just like a
sections.
book or a movie. You always have to have the prelude. You have to show the establishing shot of where people are at before you
Mm-hmm.
can go into everything else.
Put them
So
in the space.
right. Exactly. Tell them what your idea is, and then you can tell them how you got that idea executed in your project. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to belabor this project or at this point too far. The other thing I did want to talk about though is now that you've gone through it, I'm sure we've picked up a lot of practical tips that we can pass on to students who are trying to win their first competition ever. And I'm trying to think about what would be those most compelling tips that you've learned retroactively or just thinking in hindsight that you think really helped you A, stand out from the rest of your studio, B, find really critical ideas through the research phase or whatever, and just general presentation tips, developing certain cadences, figuring out how to deliver certain lines or
The
practicing
flow.
those kind of things. So that's the three major categories I want to try and focus these tips for.
Big tips that helped me along the way were to approach every project humbly. That's an attitude about architecture that you have to develop. Obviously, that encourages a lot of research. Another thing that really helped me was sketching and talking with you guys. I kind of view those as one cohesive process almost, because it was just different ways for me to have an idea and spit it out and talk with you guys and
Feedback.
put it on paper and then show it to a professor or get feedback from you guys and just be asking questions. Another huge one for me, like I said earlier, quote from my current professor, you know you're right on it when you're having fun. Research something that is interesting to you. If you're interested in economics, go find out about the economics of that place. Just find a way to connect with it personally, because if you're not interested, why should the jurors be?
That's a huge one. Yeah. Using that to pivot into one of the tips I was thinking about. How are you going to convince people your project is great if you're not interested in it yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a good part of that too is just learning how to present your ideas in just really captivating ways. Part of that is specifically when I was getting ready for the Mako competition, I was freaking out because I've never done some type of speech like this in front of this many people. So I'm like, oh my God, how do people do this thing? So I was just studying my ass off, just watching through TED Talk after TED Talk of how are people slowing down, using specific moments to speed up and slow down, trying to really dig deep into certain points, and then breezing past other ones that just are supplemental information
Mm-hmm.
to things. And that just takes a lot of practice and a lot of research. And it's nothing that you're going to nail right away. But if you are able to at least start to study these things, learn how people talk about important things, there's a lot you can start to pick up from that. For one, especially listening to Bjark Ingels TED Talks, I still say this all the time, but I think he's really great at just teaching you big picture idea into diagram into final project. I don't know if he's like the number one, but he certainly is a master at doing it. There's a reason why he's as famous as he is today.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of my biggest precedents for learning how to showcase projects, how to talk about projects, and even more so explaining it in a portfolio fashion or at the career fair, able to synthesize it down to just a 3 minute boom, 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 and getting people's reactions from that.
What I would say is focus on research. I may be biased because I'm a very research heavy person, but you can't really start a project without research. It's like you're not respecting the people who are going to use it. You're not respecting the building typology. You're not respecting anything at all. And so when you start something without research, it's just, I don't know, I just find it so disrespectful to architecture and to the people that is going to use that space, because they are the ones that are going to be using it. And you can't be the egotistical architect that says, hey, this is what you need, even though they might need it, but without the research behind it, they will never believe
Where's
you.
your proof?
Yeah.
One final thing I will point out too, and this is just from a third party perspective, looking at the entire competition from the actual seats in the auditorium, we were noticing that there was a very big difference in the other people's, I guess, champions, if you want to call it that, like their project proposals versus what you had proposed. And one of the things that I noticed, and this might have just have been a very big coincidence, but you could tell there was a very strong emphasis in everyone else's proposals using screens as their building.
Facades.
You could tell that there was a difference between, as you were talking about, your deeper research and really understanding a lot more about these cultures and how to try and properly represent that.
Having been in studio with a lot of those folks, a lot of the people that were up there with me were people that I would go to and trust their judgment about an architectural decision. Having like seen the process of a lot of them, they did have different ways in which their research affected the insides of their buildings. There was definitely something about like the primary expression being on the facade was definitely a present element. I saw their process, so I knew the ways in which they were putting those ideas inside the building, but I think it has to do with cohesion, I think, and how what's inside connects to what's outside, connects to the big idea.
Yeah.
We talked a long time now about just a lot of great insights about what could possibly set you apart from other students, and it's just when you're dealing with the top of the top, what are those micro detailed decisions that you choose to do or not do that possibly lead you to a win, a dub. So we at the end of our episodes, we like to do these takeaways. And as per guest honor, if you would like to go first about what you think is the biggest lesson out of all of the things that we talked about today, to try and synthesize it into a couple sentences or so, what do you think is the biggest idea or the best advice to take away from this?
I would say approaching each project humbly and with empathy will allow you to do research that is meaningful and impacts your process. And having done that research, you will be more able to tell a cohesive and rich story about developing the project that will be convincing to yourself and others.
That's good. Albert, you go next.
Me? What?
Yeah.
Oh no. Oh no. I think, okay, piggybacking what Andrew said, I think it relates back to research as well, and how to really bring that along with your narrative and how you present the project. You need to be very, like, you've done all the research. Now you need to just be able to nitpick which ones you will be presenting on. Don't dwell on too much information, because that's what I do. A lot of my front half is like so super heavy research, and so whenever I present, sometimes a lot of those heavy research based things actually end up in my project. But there's an even better way where now you need to figure out what pieces relate back to your project and what you need to present that project. So you need to focus on those parts so that you are not making people sit through all the research, all the process that you've done through the past, 15 weeks doing the project already. You need to just give them the things that so that they can be able to enjoy their meal.
Yeah, I think for my final takeaway, or piggybacking off of Albert too, I think the filtering part is very crucial. Just even though you have a billion ideas, choosing which one is the one to go with. When you're getting into the competitions, just really trusting that you will know your story best and how to express that in a format that's just very passionate. The more passionate you are about your project, it's easier for people to believe that you had developed this to the best of your abilities. Even if there are certain areas that you might feel slightly less confident about or want to dive past, it's just part of you to understand and realize you're in this competition now. Like, you were selected for a reason. Own the fact that you're here sitting in front of these people, and now it's time to make everyone proud and present yourself and your project as best as you can, and just really own the fact that you're here.
Amazing.
Yay.
Well, that's all for this episode. Thank you guys so much for listening in. Thank you, Andrew, for being an amazing guest, as always.
Also, make sure you guys follow us on Crit Room Podcast and let us know other topics that you want us to talk about. Feel free to DM us and we'll get back to you and let us know exactly what you're wanting to hear about in your studios and what's going on. Keep us in the loop. Yeah. And also, if you like this episode, check out our last week's episode on Brain Break, and we will see you guys in the next episode.
Bye.
And don't forget to save.
Don't forget to save.
Yeah.